Anatomy of a good farm lease. I hope every one of you that are renting land have a written lease. If you don't, this would be the first good step you would make. And if that's all you took away from this today, then I think it was well worth it. Every lease should be in writing. And if you need a written lease, I will promote FarmDoc numerous times today. It is the best website to go to for landowners. Your leases should have the name and addresses of the tenant and landlord. You should have the legal description, the terms of the lease. Is it a single-year lease? Is it a multi-year lease? The rent or the compensation, how is that going to be determined? That should be in the lease. If the lease is only for a year, many leases have the right of re-entry in the fall. If the lease is not going to be renewed, then you have the right to get back or get onto the property or have someone else take care of the fall work after the harvest has been done. And then binding on heirs, it's a legal type of wording that if something were to happen to you and it went to your kids or to a spouse, those contracts automatically fall over to the surviving party in there. We're going to cover several leases. Gary's pretty much touched base on all of these. Are the only one that maybe we'll add to a little bit is a custom farming contract that has been in use for a number of years. But we're going to, with these are the 4 types of leases that are fairly common in our area. If we look at the various types of leases, this is some information from the Illinois Society of Farm Managers and Real Appraisers. It touches base on the percentage of how these leases are being used. And if I combine the crop share leases, the first 3 are basically some form of a crop share. That equates to about 44% of all the leases. The cash rent leases, the traditional and variable, come up to be around 30%, and the variable, the custom is around 9%. And the custom leases have been fairly consistent in that area, in that 10% range. There hasn't been much of a change over the last number of years that we've noticed. The one lease that has gained a little more popularity that Gary touched on is the variable cash rent. And right now that is around 17%, and that's increased about 2% over the last year. We'll have some new numbers next week to see if there's been any changes. And these numbers come from the farm managers here in the state of Illinois. Real briefly, this is kind of 101 leases. So for those of you that have already know this, bear with us, we'll move through this. The crop share lease is where the owner and operator receive a share, as we've already talked about. The owner typically furnishes the land and buildings. The tenant usually furnishes the labor, fuel, and equipment. But there are variations that exist in the sharing of the expenses, as Gary talked about. The advantages are those risks are shared with everyone, both parties, and they can benefit from the unexpected high yields and prices, which has been the case for the last 3 years. And the owner is involved with making the decisions. And I know there have been some questions earlier. It's always good if you want to be involved and you have a real interest in that you be a part of those decisions. There are a number of landowners that we work with that want to be involved, even though they use our services in grain marketing and other things like that, and that's fine. Some of the disadvantages, you have to both agree on what's going to happen. Typically, the farm operator brings to the table his experience of farming. He knows the land, but the owner has just as much of a right to what is going to happen on that farm as the operator. We've seen some adjustments to the traditional 50-50 crop share lease, which sometimes can cause a little conflict between the two. And as Gary touched on, we're seeing some of those, whether they're in a cash rent. We have seen some leases where the landowner is taking some of those expenses, especially in the chemicals, and shifting it to the operator. Now, that's a discussion point that may work for you, it may not. All these things are things that you can work out with your landowner, your tenant, and see what will work. The argument for the chemicals, and I agree with what Gary said earlier, we typically, if there's a chemical, if the operator is paying for chemicals, those are typically paid up front that are the normal types of herbicides that are applied, the pre-emerge and post-emerge. If there are special applications, say there's a fungicide application and later in the fall we got issues with disease or insects, then those types of expenses have been shared equally between the owner and the operator. those are what we kind of consider the more special type of applications that don't occur every year. But once again, those agreements need to be in that lease. It needs to be in writing, and everyone needs to understand ahead of time what's expected. Those where conflicts come into play is when it's not spelled out ahead of time. And certainly if it's not in the lease and something arises, you need to sit down with your operator and you need to discuss it before it takes place. As I just mentioned, adding it has been shifted. Most of the time it's chemicals. We really don't see much in the fertilizer change. It's usually 50-50. This is a slide that Gary showed earlier that I guess I'll just kind of reiterate. On the high productive farms, which is the darker line up on top, it actually has been a better return than the professionally managed cash rent farms. And although we haven't seen a lot of shifting back to crop share, it certainly has been very competitive. Your lower producing share rent farms has not been as competitive as what the cash rent market is. So if you have a farm that you're thinking about possibly shifting back, look at what its capability is. Is it a highly productive farm? If there's a lot of risk, if the drainage is not all that great, then you may want to consider whether you not want to assume some more risk, because under the cash rent scenario, you do have a fairly constant return that you can receive each year. All right, in the fixed cash rent, it's paid given a cash amount per year for the use of the farm. This is something I want to bring up because we do run into this quite a bit. The owner can impose certain restrictions on how the farm is operated. Now, sometimes we get a landlord and say, well, he basically can do what he wants. Well, that's not true, because who owns the farm? The landowner. We have landowners now that, some of them are looking at, I'd like to see my operator be a little more environmentally friendly. We're looking at maybe cutting back on the types of chemicals. Maybe we're looking at organic, that type of thing. Can I ask my operator to do that? And yes, it's your farm. You can dictate how the farm is going to be operated. If you have something, well, I don't want any moldboard plowing anymore, you can do that, as long as they know ahead of time and it's in the lease. So don't forget the fact that it's your farm, and if the operator doesn't want to agree to that, well, then he has the choice of whether he would want to farm it or not. And most of the time, our farmers aren't really wanting to give up farmland. They want to maintain it, but you need to communicate your needs and wants with them. Other than those pre-approved, discussed items, the tenant can operate the farm in any manner that's most typical in farming operations here in the Midwest. The advantages of the cash rent, the owner's relieved of making that day-to-day operating decision. You have limited financial risk, albeit there is some. And the tenant has the freedom to put together a crop plan and farm it the way he feels he can make the most money. If he wants to plant all soybeans, as long as it's okay with the owner, you can do that. Now, I've got some farm operators that they want to see rotation. They don't want a farm operator every year planting corn. Well, we have to convey that to our tenant to make sure he understands that. It may not be economically benefit to the operator, but he understands ahead of time what the owner is wanting. As Gary touched, the most difficult part of a cash rent is negotiating the rent. And we'll get into a little bit of that later on. And rents are typically based, cash rents are typically based on past performance. So as we go into 2014, we looked at what happened in 2013. We don't do a very good job, other than if we listen to Gary and the folks at U of I, what it's going to be like in 2015, because there are many variables that can happen, and the biggest thing is weather. We don't know what weather's going to be like. The collection of rent can be difficult if during the year or some particular time the tenant becomes financially strapped and has a difficult time making the payment. As Gary mentioned earlier, more and more of our newer leases are becoming where the operator is paying all of the rent up front, typically in March. And that way you have your money, you don't have any risk, and it's all taken care of. Now, that being said, if you've got a tenant that's been on the farm for the last 20, 30 years, and all of a sudden you decide, say, hey, Mr. Tenant, now I'm going to make you pay it all up front, they may get a little cross-eyed with you and wonder what changed all that. So you have to know who your tenant is, and it's not a bad idea to ask your tenant, can I have a current financial statement? How well are they? That's a difficult thing maybe to ask him, but for our clients, we do ask that when they don't pay it all up front. We also will secure either a lien on the property, or we will more than likely ask that his banker give us a letter of credit from the bank. Now, the letter of credit from the bank will cost the tenant money, because the banks aren't doing that for free anymore. So, but we do this all the time because, we don't want to be managing farm property and then all of a sudden our tenant comes up short, and then they're looking at us and say, all right, Mr. Manager, what are you going to do with my shortfall? I need that money. So, those are things to consider. On the flex cash, your rent's going to vary. It's going to depend on prices and yields. It's probably going to be more in tune with what the farming operation's like that year, because you're going to have prices and yields that are actually going to be measured by that current year. Now, you are now stepping out of limited risk into a little more risk when you go to the flexible lease. And as Gary said, that is a whole session of itself, but I'll try to step into that and give you some basics of what we see with flexible leases. And we do use those on some of our farms. The advantage is that the actual rent paid adjusts, as we talked about, to yield and prices. The risks, once again, are kind of shared, and that's some of the benefits, because sometimes the tenant feels like, well, in some cases my rent is so high, and now you're asking me to make these payments, and I have a poor year, and I can't. And likewise on the owner, they have a great year, and the owner's saying, my golly, now you made a whole ton of money, and I only got this amount. So this kind of balances that out a little bit in the sharing of the profits. The negotiating is not nearly as important as, because the final rent is based on the production price. Although we'll talk a little bit later, that base price can be, or the base rent can be a little difficult to come up with. Okay. Disadvantages, got to agree on the formula for setting the base rent, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And both parties must agree on how do you determine the price and yield. And that's one of the things with the flex. It is kind of complicated, but if you can sit down and work through it, once you get it set, it usually works pretty well. After the first year. Now, if you're somebody who wants to know how much money you're going to make every year, and you want it to be consistent year in and year out, this probably isn't the lease for you, because there's going to be fluctuation based upon how the markets and prices and yields go each year. So you need to evaluate. If you're willing to, assume that prices, you may have a really great year, the next year, whoa, things are way down, you're going to have to see whether that's something you can live with. As I mentioned before, 17% of all the leases were in some sort of a flex lease. This compares to 15% in 2002. Now, some of the key ingredients that we think need to be to make a good flex lease is, how are you going to determine, the payment? Is it going to be a share of the gross revenue on the farm? Is it going to be a base rent plus bonus? Establishing that base can be the most difficult part. The base rent is typically less than the going cash rent out there. Now, I don't know what that is, but you're not going to get the very, very top, because you're trying. You hope you get there with good years, but the base is typically less than the going rate. The other part of it is determining the price. Gary talked about this. Is it a local elevator, river terminal? We've used crop insurance. We have crop insurance prices that are established in the spring and the fall, and you can take those prices and use that as a price. Or, as he mentioned, you can take an average price over a number of months. Once again, those are all things that you need to think about and discuss with your tenant. Government payments, which are not going to be applicable this year, have been applied, and then crop insurance payments. That's been something back a couple years ago. We had huge crop insurance payments, and some of the leases didn't have any indication of payments coming back because of crop insurance. So that has changed a little bit now where they're saying, well, if there is a payment, this is how much you're going to get of that. So once again, something that we have to think about when we're putting these together. Some of the reasons for possibly using a flex lease, commodity prices. I mean, my gosh, we've been, over 7 and we've been, close to 4. Huge swings, uncertain yields, rising input costs, uncertainty of the farm profitability. It's trying to create kind of a so-called fair cash rent. We think it's probably a little more reasonable way of establishing the cash rent. It takes away the, well, this is what it was last year, so this is what we're going to do this year. And so by having that built-in bonus in the current year takes away some of that, well, he got more than I did, or I lost money and he's making money type of thing. And there's a lot of emotion in it. Finally, we'll talk on the custom leases. This is where the operator provides all the labor, all the equipment to perform, and the landowner pays him for doing all of that. And the operator receives all of the revenue. He pays the expenses of the farm, he pays all the fertilizer, for chemicals, all of the input costs, he pays for those. He also receives the landowner receives USDA payment because he's financially involved in that farm. The operator then in return either receives a fixed amount of money or he gets a percentage of what the revenue is from the farm. We like to see a bonus involved on our custom leases because that's an incentive for the operator to do as good a job as he can. And if he does well and he achieves the goals that were set ahead of time, then he is able to be rewarded as well. And in certain situations, this type of lease works really well. The owner benefits from this because of high prices and yields. The owner is basically responsible. He or she is doing 100% of the grain marketing. And the agreements are fairly easy. It isn't as complicated as putting together a flex lease. The disadvantages, on those poorer years, your returns are going not to be as good as it would be under other types of leases. I think this is important. You as an owner, if you're in a custom lease, you need to provide the timely, concise expectations of what you expect from your tenant. Okay, I want you here, and I want you to come to my farm and get it planted this time. I want you to be here to spray it. I want you to be here to harvest it. All of these things have to be discussed with the farm operator ahead of time, and you need to understand how it's going to be done, because the farm operator probably has a lot of other farms that he's operating saying, well, I'll get there when I can. Well, you need to say, well, this is when I want you here, and he needs to understand that ahead of time. If a farm, in my opinion, if a farm has a wide array of soil types, drainage problems, it may not be the best for this type of a lease, because the more variability you have, in poor years, if you've got your farm is prone to flood, has soil types that aren't as buffering to the weather conditions, your returns might be disappointing. I always think that the better the soils, the drainage, fits better for a custom lease than some of the poorer soils.